All right. So today we're diving into something pretty unusual.
Definitely unusual.
A brochure that the Swedish government sent out
Yeah.
to every single household in the country.
Mm.
And it's all about how to prepare for a crisis.
Like a big one.
Yeah. And I mean, crises in general.
Mm.
But they're not shying away from the fact that this includes the possibility of war.
Not at all.
So really, it's a sign of the times, I guess you could say.
It is. It really reflects, I think, the global climate right now and how countries are starting to think about preparing their citizens, not just militarily,
Right.
but also psychologically and socially.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this brochure so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about, having a go bag or an emergency kit.
Right.
It's really about building a resilient society.
It is. It's about that bigger picture.
Okay, so let's imagine we're in Sweden.
Okay.
We've just gotten this brochure in the mail.
Mm-hmm. All right.
What's the first thing that jumps out at us?
Well, the brochure is very, very upfront about what it's trying to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Its purpose is to get people ready
Okay.
for a whole bunch of serious situations,
Ah.
not just armed conflict,
Right.
although obviously that's a big part of it.
Of course, given the current global climate.
Right, but it's broader than that.
So it's acknowledging that the world is a pretty unpredictable place right now.
It is. It's definitely acknowledging that uncertainty.
Does it get into specifics about like what kinds of threats they're talking about?
Oh, yeah, it names a whole list.
Yep.
Cyber attacks,
Mhm.
disinformation campaigns,
Mhm.
terrorism,
Wow.
even things like extreme weather events
Oh, wow.
and
Oh, 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 oh,
pandemics.
oh. Okay, so like really the whole spectrum of things that
Pretty much anything you can think of.
it could disrupt our lives.
Exactly. And that's, I think, a really important point,
Yeah.
that it's all interconnected.
Yeah.
One crisis can lead into another.
Absolutely.
And being prepared for one can actually help you be more prepared for others.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's that ripple effect. Yeah, like if you lose power in a natural disaster,
Exactly.
well, those skills of, knowing how to cook on a camp stove or whatever
Hmm.
could also be useful in a conflict situation.
Absolutely.
So how does Sweden approach this whole idea?
Well, they have a name for it.
Okay.
They call it total defense.
Total defense.
Yeah, and it's a big idea in this brochure.
Okay.
It's this idea that everybody in the country has a part to play
Wow.
in national security.
Oh,
It's not just the military's job.
That's a powerful concept.
It is. It's really empowering in a way.
Yeah, because it suggests that citizens aren't just, bystanders.
Yeah.
They're actually part of the defense strategy.
Exactly. They're active participants.
And how does the brochure break down this whole total defense idea?
Well, it shows all the different parts of it.
Okay.
You've got the government agencies,
Mm-hmm.
local communities, businesses, and of course, individual citizens all working together.
So it's a pretty complex system.
It is. It's multi-layered.
Okay, so let's get into the practical stuff here.
Okay.
What kind of advice are they actually giving people about being prepared?
All right. Well, let's start with what to have at home.
Okay.
One of the first things they say is you got to have water.
Water. Okay.
And not just a little bit.
Right.
They say at least 3 liters of water per person.
3 liters
Yeah.
per day.
Per day. That's a lot of water.
It is. It sounds like a lot, but they make a good point.
Okay.
If something happens, your water supply could be disrupted.
Okay.
Infrastructure damage, contamination, who knows?
Right.
So having that water stored up
Makes sense.
means you can stay hydrated.
Yeah.
You can use it for cooking, even for basic hygiene.
You're not just thinking about drinking it. You're thinking about all the other uses.
Exactly. It's essential for so many things.
Okay. So water. Check.
What about food?
Yes. The other essential.
Right.
They recommend having enough food to last you and your family for at least a week.
A week?
Yeah.
That's a decent amount of time.
Yep. And it's not just any food either.
Okay, so what kind of food are we talking about?
They say you want non-perishable stuff.
Okay, so canned goods, things like that.
Exactly. Canned goods, dried meats, nuts, grains,
Foods that will last.
things that will keep and won't go bad quickly.
Right, and also things that are relatively compact and easy to store.
Exactly. Space is a consideration too.
So non-perishable, easy to store, but they also mention something about protein and fat.
Yes, that's important.
Okay, why is that?
Well, they're thinking about the energy you'll need.
Okay.
During a crisis, you might be under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
You might be physically active, maybe moving around a lot or doing manual labor.
Right, like if you had to evacuate or something.
Exactly. So you need food that's going to give you sustained energy.
So not just empty calories.
Exactly. You need that protein and fat to keep you going.
Okay, so we've got water, we've got food.
The basics.
What about warmth and shelter?
All right, well, those are big considerations, especially in Sweden.
Right, with the winters they have.
Exactly. So the brochure talks about having alternative ways to stay warm if the power goes out.
Right.
So warm clothes, obviously, blankets, maybe a non-electric heater if you have one.
Like a kerosene heater or something.
Right. Anything that can generate heat without electricity.
And what about shelter? I mean, do they advise people to build bunkers or something?
Not quite bunkers, but Sweden does have a network of civil defense shelters.
Civil defense shelters, interesting.
Yeah, and the brochure tells people to know where the nearest shelter is.
Okay, so it's not just about staying at home. It's also about knowing where to go if your home isn't safe.
Exactly, and these shelters are designed to protect people from a whole range of threats.
Okay.
Air raids, radioactive fallout, things like that.
That's serious business.
It is. They're usually located underground.
Makes sense.
And they're marked with a special symbol,
Okay.
a blue triangle and an orange rectangle.
I'll have to keep an eye out for that if I'm ever in Sweden.
It's good to know.
So we've got supplies, we've got shelter. What about communication?
Ah, yes, communication is key.
Right, because you need to know what's going on.
Exactly. So they recommend having a battery-powered radio. Or even better, a hand crank radio.
So you don't have to worry about batteries running out.
Exactly. And they specifically mention a station called Sveriges Radio P4.
Okay.
That's the official emergency broadcast channel.
So I assume that's like what we have in the U.S. where certain radio stations are designated for emergency broadcasts.
Yeah.
So you can tune in and get information even if the internet's down or cell service is out.
Right. It's about having that reliable source of information.
Okay, so this is all about being prepared for physical threats. But I know the brochure goes beyond that.
Oh, yeah. It goes much deeper than that.
And that's what we're going to dive into in the next part of our deep dive.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.
We're going to be talking about psychological defense.
That's a big one.
And how the brochure addresses the mental and emotional challenges of living in uncertain times.
Can't wait to unpack that one.
It's a fascinating stuff, so stick with us.
All right, so we're back, and we're continuing to explore this really interesting Swedish preparedness brochure.
Yeah, this thing is packed with information.
It is.
We were talking about the practical side of things,
Right, the supplies.
The supplies you need to have at home.
Exactly.
And it gets pretty specific.
It does. It doesn't just say have food and water.
Right.
It actually lists specific items.
Like what, for example?
Well, for one thing, it talks about having a first aid kit.
Okay, a first aid kit. That makes sense.
But it goes even further.
Okay, how so?
It specifically says that you should have supplies in there for treating serious bleeding.
Really? Why the focus on bleeding?
Well, they make the point that if there's a major crisis, medical help might not be available right away.
Right. You might not be able to get to a hospital or...
Exactly. Or maybe the hospitals are overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
It is. And they're saying that in that situation...
Yeah.
Knowing how to control bleeding could be crucial.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's about being able to take care of yourself.
Yeah, and potentially others, too.
Exactly. You could be saving someone's life.
So it's not just about bandages and antiseptic.
Right. It's about having those more advanced supplies.
Like what kind of supplies are we talking about?
Well, things like tourniquets.
Okay.
Hemostatic dressings. Things that can really stop heavy bleeding.
Yeah, stuff that you might not normally have in a basic first aid kit.
Right, but that could be essential in a real emergency.
Okay, so first aid kit, check.
Check.
What other kinds of specific items does the brochure recommend?
Well, it mentions a whistle.
A whistle.
Yeah, to signal for help.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Especially if you're trapped or lost.
Right. Or if you need to attract attention.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
They say a flashlight with extra batteries.
Of course. Got to have a flashlight.
And then they also recommend a hand crank weather radio.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so you can get weather updates and emergency broadcasts.
Even if the power is out.
Even if the power's out. No need for batteries.
That's pretty clever.
It is. It's about being prepared for multiple scenarios.
So they've really thought through the different things that could happen.
They have. They've really tried to anticipate the needs people might have.
Now, does it also talk about what to do in case of specific threats?
It does. It gives some really specific guidance.
Okay, like what?
Well, for instance, if there's a terrorist attack,
Okay.
they emphasize the run, hide, tell protocol.
Run, hide, tell. Okay, remind me what that is again.
Basically, it means if you can get away safely,
Yeah, run.
get out of there.
Okay.
If you can't run, find a place to hide
Okay.
and make yourself as safe as possible.
Barricade yourself in, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And then tell.
Call the authorities, report what's happening.
Okay, so it's a clear set of steps.
It is. It gives people a framework for action.
So in a moment of panic,
Right, you have a plan.
you know what to do.
Exactly. It helps to avoid freezing up.
Okay, so terrorist attack, run, hide,
Good.
tell.
Got it.
What about other kinds of threats, like cyber attacks, for example?
Oh, yeah, they address that too.
What kind of advice did they give for that?
Well, one of the things they say is, if you suspect you're under attack,
Huh.
disconnect from the internet.
Just unplug?
Unplug, yeah, pull a plug,
Yeah.
and then change your passwords.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's about containing the damage.
Right, preventing the spread of malware or whatever.
Exactly, and protecting your personal data.
So it's not just about waiting for things to get back to normal
Right. It's about taking proactive steps
to protect yourself.
to protect yourself and your information.
Okay, so we've talked about terrorist attacks, cyber attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that they specifically address in terms of threats?
Well, they talk about extreme weather events,
Okay.
which are becoming more,
Right, with climate change and all that.
Exactly. So they give advice on how to prepare for things like storms,
Okay.
floods, heat waves.
So it's tailored to the specific risks that Sweden faces.
It is. It takes into account their geography and climate.
Now, we talked earlier about total defense.
Right. That big idea.
This idea that everyone in society has a role to play.
Mm-hmm.
Does the brochure give specific examples of how ordinary citizens can contribute?
It does. It talks about a few different things.
Okay.
For one, it encourages people to volunteer
Okay.
with local emergency response organizations.
Like the Red Cross or something?
Yeah, organizations like that.
Okay.
And it also talks about helping to spread accurate information.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, because during a crisis...
There's a lot of misinformation flying around.
Exactly. So being a source of reliable information
It's really important.
is really valuable.
Okay, and what about just like everyday things? Is there anything that people can do?
Yeah, they talk about just being a good neighbor.
Oh, come on.
Checking in on people who might need help.
Especially elderly folks or people with disabilities.
Exactly. People who might be more vulnerable.
So it's about building those community connections.
It is. It's about looking out for each other.
So it's not just about having the right supplies.
Right. It's about having that social support network.
That's a good point, because in a crisis, your neighbors might be the ones you have to rely on.
They might be the ones who can help you.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. We've talked about physical preparedness.
Right, having the right supplies, knowing what to do in specific situations. But I want to circle back to this idea of psychological defense.
Right, because that's a big part of the brochure, too.
What else does it say about that?
Well, it goes into some detail about the tactics
Okay.
that might be used in disinformation campaigns.
Okay, so like what kind of tactics are we talking about?
Well, one thing they mention is the use of emotionally charged language.
Okay.
You know, trying to trigger fear or anger.
Right, playing on people's emotions.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
They talk about the spread of rumors
Okay.
and conspiracy theory.
Which can be really hard to debunk.
They can, especially when people are already feeling stressed or anxious.
Right.
And then they also warn about attempts to discredit
Okay.
official sources of information.
Oh, so like saying that the government is lying or covering something up.
Exactly, trying to erode trust in authority.
So basically it's giving people the tools to recognize when they're being manipulated. It is. It's about developing that critical eye.
And not just believing everything you see or hear.
Exactly, especially during a crisis when information is so important.
Right, you need to be able to separate fact from fiction.
And that's not always easy.
No, it's not.
But the brochure gives some good tips.
Okay, like what?
Well, one thing they say is to check multiple sources.
Okay, don't just rely on one website or one news channel.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
They say to be wary of information that's very emotionally charged.
Right, if it's designed to make you really angry or really scared.
Exactly. That should be a red flag.
Okay.
And then they also recommend relying on official government channels. Okay, so like government websites or press releases.
Exactly, because those are more likely to have accurate information.
So it's about being discerning about where you get your information from.
It is. It's about being a critical consumer of information.
Which is a skill that's valuable in any situation.
It is, but it's especially important during a crisis.
When the stakes are higher.
Exactly.
So we've talked about physical preparedness. We've talked about psychological defense. What about the emotional and mental strain?
Oh, that's it.
Of living in uncertain times.
Yeah, that's a real thing.
Does the brochure address that at all?
It does. It actually has a whole section
Oh, wow.
on maintaining mental well-being.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, they recognize that crises can take a toll on people's mental health.
Absolutely.
And they give some really good advice.
Okay, like what?
Well, one thing they say is to try to maintain a routine as much as possible.
So like stick to your normal sleep schedule.
Yeah, have regular meal times, things like that. Because that can provide a sense of stability.
Right, when everything else feels chaotic.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
They talk about the importance of connecting with loved ones.
Oh, yeah, just talking to people you care about.
Exactly, getting that social support.
Okay.
And they also recommend limiting exposure to upsetting news.
Oh, that's a good one, because it's easy to get sucked into.
It is. You can end up doom scrolling all day.
Right, and that's not good for anyone's mental health.
It's not. So they're saying be mindful of your news consumption.
Yeah.
And then if you're really struggling,
Yeah.
they encourage people to reach out for professional help.
That's important because there's no shame in asking for help.
Absolutely. And it might be necessary.
So they're acknowledging that this is a real issue.
They are. They're not sugarcoating it.
Mental health is just as important as physical health.
Exactly. You got to take care of both.
This brochure is really impressive.
It is. It's incredibly thorough.
It seems to cover every aspect of preparedness.
It does. They've really thought of everything.
Before we move on to the final segment,
Yeah.
I want to touch on one more thing.
Right.
Digital security.
Ah, yes. That's another big one.
I know the brochure addresses that as well.
It does. It has a whole section on it.
Okay, because that's a growing concern these days.
It is. Cyber attacks are becoming more and more common.
So what kind of advice do they give in that area?
Well, they cover a lot of the basics.
Okay.
Like using strong passwords,
Right.
being careful about what links you click on,
Okay.
and keeping your software updated.
So basically, good cyber hygiene practices.
Exactly. Things that you should be doing anyway.
But they emphasize that it's even more important during a crisis.
Right, because the bad guys are going to try to take advantage.
Right. They're going to be looking for vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
So it's about being extra vigilant.
It is. It's about being aware of the risks.
And taking steps to protect yourself.
To protect yourself and your data.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has. It's been fascinating to explore this brochure.
The Swedish government has really put a lot of thought into this.
They have, and I think there's a lot we can learn from it.
Yeah, there's a lot of good advice here.
Even if we don't live in Sweden.
Right, because a lot of these principles apply anywhere.
Absolutely.
In the final segment, we're going to wrap up our discussion
Okay.
and talk about the bigger picture.
The big picture.
What does this brochure tell us about how nations are thinking about security in the 21st century?
That's the big question.
It's a fascinating one.
It is.
So stick with us.
Welcome back for the final part of our look at this Swedish preparedness brochure.
It's been a really interesting deep dive.
It has.
I mean, we've talked about the practical stuff,
Yeah, it's supplied.
the mental and emotional aspects,
Mhm.
even digital security.
It's all in there.
So as we kind of wrap things up here,
Okay.
what for you stands out as the most significant takeaway from this whole thing?
I think for me, the biggest thing is this underlying philosophy
Okay.
of shared responsibility.
Shared responsibility.
Yeah, it's not just about telling people what to do.
Right.
It's about empowering them
Okay.
to be active participants
In their own security.
in their own security and the security of their community.
So it's that total defense concept we talked about.
Exactly. Everyone has a role to play.
Not just the military.
Right. It's a whole of society approach.
And I think that's really important
It is.
because the threats we face today,
Mhm.
they're not just military threats.
Right.
They're complex.
They're multifaceted.
They can come from anywhere.
So it's not enough
Yo,
to just build up our military.
it's got to be more than that.
We need to build a society
Mm-hmm.
that's resilient.
Resilient, adapt.
Able to withstand all sorts of challenges.
Exactly, able to bounce back.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting to think about how this approach
Okay.
might apply to other countries.
Right, because
Sweden.
they have their own unique history and culture.
They do.
So what works for them might not necessarily work everywhere else.
That's true. It's not a one-size-fits-all model.
But are there some universal principles here
I think so.
that could be adapted
Yeah.
and applied in different contexts?
Absolutely. There are some key ideas that I think are relevant anywhere.
Okay, like what?
Well, one of the big ones is this emphasis on community resilience.
Community resilience.
Yeah, the brochure talks a lot about the
Exactly.
importance of strong social networks,
Okay.
mutual aid, people helping each other out.
Right, looking out for your neighbors.
Exactly. That's something that can be fostered anywhere.
Regardless of culture or political system,
It's a basic human need.
yeah, we all need to feel connected.
To feel supported.
And that's especially important in times of crisis.
Absolutely. When things are tough.
You need to know that you're not alone.
That someone has your back.
And that's what community resilience is all about.
It is. It's about knowing that you can count on each other.
And I think that's a really powerful message.
It is. It's a message of hope.
Yeah, even in the face of all these challenges.
Yeah. We can overcome them together.
Now, another thing that struck me about this brochure
Okay.
is the emphasis on communication.
Right. Communication is key.
And trust.
Especially between the government and the citizens.
Right. Because if there's no trust, then people aren't going to follow instructions.
They're not going to cooperate.
They're going to be suspicious.
Exactly. So building that trust
is essential.
It's foundational.
And that's something that takes time.
It does. It takes effort.
And it takes transparency.
Like transparency, accountability.
Now, the section on psychological defense, I think that's also really relevant.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially today.
With all the misinformation out there.
Yeah. The propaganda.
The manipulation.
It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
It is. It's overwhelming.
So having those skills to discern truth from falsehood.
Critical thinking skill.
Media literacy.
All of that.
Those are essential.
They're survival skills in the 21st century.
Yeah, and the brochure frames it as a core competency.
It does.
For citizens.
It's not just about protecting yourself from bombs and bullets.
Right. It's also about protecting yourself from lies and manipulation.
It's about being an informed citizen.
An engaged citizen.
Someone who can think for themselves.
And make informed decisions.
Based on facts, not fear.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Swedish preparedness brochure, I'm struck by how comprehensive it is.
It is. It's incredibly thorough.
And how forward-thinking it is.
They're really looking ahead.
It's not just about surviving a crisis.
Right.
It's about thriving.
Thriving, building a better future.
And I think there's a lot that other countries can learn from it.
I agree. There's a lot of wisdom in this brochure.
So thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful.
And maybe even a little bit inspiring.
And we hope it's given you some food for thought.
Food for thought and maybe some motivation.
To take some steps to build your own resilience.
Because we can all be more prepared.
Absolutely. And we can all make a difference.
That's the message I take away from this.
Me too. Thanks again for joining us.